Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. You know, we consider each and every week's show really important. I would say this is among the most important shows we'll do for the foreseeable future because it's about election administration for the very big election in front of us. We were recently in Atlanta. There was a meeting of election officials from across the country, and we sat down with 4 from very closely contested states. They will introduce themselves to you as we start this conversation. But we began with the 4 of them with one very simple question.
Jocelyn Benson, and my title is Michigan Secretary of State.
Seth Bluestein, City Commissioner of Philadelphia.
Bill Gates, and I'm a member of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. I represent District 3.
Gabriel Sterling, Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, State of Georgia.
This year's election fills you with
Joy.
Hope.
Excitement.
I feel there should be joy, but there is some angst.
why?
The biggest thing I worry about is the possibility of violence, again, regardless of outcome, by people who lose. And that's the biggest thing that is at the highest level of my concerns, or the use of violence to attempt to change the outcome in the early run-up to the election.
Madam Secretary, you said joy. Do you have any angst or anxiety?
Of course. I mean, in Michigan, for years, as we've gone through this process before, we always say we hope for the best, but plan for every contingency. So that involves a lot of anxiety and a lot of scenario planning and a lot of thinking about the worst that could happen and then making a plan for it. But I've also been very encouraged by the number of people on both sides of the aisle in our election administration community who have really expressed a commitment to ensuring our elections processes go well. We know the spotlight will be on us, and we'll be ready.
Bill, Maricopa County has seen maybe more intensity, more rancor than any other county in America. Do you have any anxiety or angst?
I wouldn't call it anxiety or angst. We're prepared. We know what we've seen in the last 2 cycles. We're sort of ready for anything. But I've got great faith in our team, and I've got great faith in the people of Maricopa County. We're ready for this election.
Seth, how about you? Do you have anything in Philadelphia County that makes you the least bit nervous or anxious?
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, the laws haven't changed about how long it's going to take to count the mail ballots, so I have some trepidation with that. But at the same time, I have hope that we're going to get through this as a unified country, knowing that we are more prepared for this election cycle than we were in 2020.
Madam Secretary, let me ask you about that. Thinking about where your preparations are as compared to 2020, how are you feeling?
Well, we know we're facing, in many ways, a far more sophisticated operation to potentially challenge or overturn legitimate election results. We've seen the signs of that for years. But we are also more prepared as well. We've been training for this moment for years. We've been training election officials, recruiting folks, ensuring our laws are clear on, among other things, certification methods. So I feel we're far more prepared and ahead of the ball than we were at this point in 20. Of course, 20, we were also in the midst of a global pandemic and many other shifting sands, but at the same time, I'm very confident in our team, and what we've gone through in the past has really helped us wisen and prepare for any contingency that could play out in the months ahead.
Gabe, in Georgia, there was a change in the law after the 2020 election. And then there have been some conversations about the power given to either the legislature or county boards to ask questions and perhaps delay certification. Does that create problems for Georgia from your vantage point?
No, because the law on certification remains unchanged. We will certify this election by November 12th, hell or high water. The funny part about some of these rules is all they're doing is saying the things that all these county offices already do. They're supposed to be doing this, and the county boards are part of the process from the beginning to the end. And let me say this, the 4 states you have in here, I am unconcerned. They're prepared for anything. It's those states that are like really red or really blue that aren't prepared for something that might happen because they're like, oh, it's always going to be this way, it's going to be fine. They're not thinking about the possibilities, and that's what really worries me more than any of the states that were battleground states or are battleground states.
So when I read headlines, as I have, about these new powers in Georgia creating sand in the gears that could stop certification cold, you're not concerned about that?
Not really. I mean, we saw that in New Mexico and Otero County where they tried to do that, went to a quick writ of mandamus, courts weighed in and it was taken care of. And it's not like it's one person can throw sand in the gears. You have to have a majority on a county board say to do this. And if there's a very Republican or a very Democrat area that says we don't want to certify that, well, then I guess their candidate will lose by more than when we certify the state. You can't have one county hold 158 other counties hostage.
And that's not going to happen in Georgia.
It's not going to happen in Georgia.
Let me ask all of you, and I'll start with you, Bill. What are you expecting in terms of turnout?
I think we're going to have significant turnout. Again, that's one of the things that I talk about. Obviously, it's been a very difficult time for people in elections, people who've spent their career in it. But the reality is we've never seen turnout levels like this. And I anticipate the same thing this time around in Arizona, not only the presidential race, but we have several races that are getting a lot of attention, and we're ready for that heavy turnout.
So near or possibly exceeding 2020?
I think that's possible, yes.
Madam Secretary?
Well, we'll see. We have 9 days of early voting, which is new this year in Michigan because of a citizen-driven amendment that voters enacted in 2022. So we think, in particular, young people will take more advantage of the opportunity to vote early in the lead up to Election Day. And I think our numbers will be about where they were in 2020. And the big thing in Michigan is we'll expect to see many people cast their ballots before Election Day even begins.
Seth?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a similar turnout to 2020. The thing in Pennsylvania is a lot of voters are going to be returning to voting on Election Day in person at their precinct, as opposed to what we saw in 2020 when it was split about 50-50.
Will that create more burdens on the system?
No, it feels more like an election like we used to have before 2020, like a 2016 or 2012 election cycle. We know how to run those Election Day operations. In fact, it'll make it a little bit easier for counting the mail ballots.
Gabe?
I'm just glad to see other states following Georgia's lead in expanding early voting. I mean, we have 17 mandatory days and have for years. We have 2 optional Sundays that the majority of the population would take advantage of. So we have 19 days for the majority of Georgia's population. And we're going to see people kind of, from 2022, we saw them kind of fall back to their normal patterns of voting in person. And we have a majority that vote in person early, and then about 5% absentee, and then the balance usually shows up on Election Day. And we've gotten our average wait time on Election Day down to about 2 minutes statewide because of all the pre-election voting we get done, and it's been really great for the voters of Georgia.
I'll start with you, Seth, and I want to ask everyone this question because I care about this a great deal. How are your election workers doing? Will you have enough? And is there still some lingering trauma from the threats and menacing that occurred after 2020?
Yeah, I think our poll workers and our election workers are doing pretty well. They understand what they're signing up for, and they're excited to be a part of democracy in this country and really help their neighbors participate. We're always recruiting more poll workers, but we're on the right path to have enough for Election Day.
Madam Secretary?
We've recruited nearly 80,000 new election workers since 2020 for a lot of different reasons, but the main one is that a lot of people do want to step up and serve in this moment and be a part of protecting our elections and ensuring they go smoothly. And so that's a great thing, and in that way we're very prepared. We've also created and passed new laws in Michigan to make it a crime to threaten an election worker in their line of duty. And so given that, we have more protections for the people whose job it is to protect the vote for everyone else. And I think that gives us a lot of hope and optimism going into the fall. But it's also coupled with trepidation. I mean, we're daily receiving threats, whether it's through voicemails, emails, social media, or in person.
You personally?
Yes, yeah, and it's escalating. It's certainly escalating over the last few weeks. And so that, all of our optimism is coupled with a trepidation of the uncertainties that threats and harassment engender. And they're all rooted in lies and misinformation, which is always very disappointing and sad, but at the same time, it's real. And so we are preparing, doing scenario planning with law enforcement and first responders for all potential possibilities, but it does create an air of anxiety as we go into the fall.
We'll have more on election threats when segment 2 of the Takeout comes your way in just a second.
The threats are directed at me as a person. They're really directed at our democracy, and they're really directed at trying to intimidate.
Welcome back to the Takeout. It is an uncomfortable and unpleasant truth that people who administer our elections are facing hostility and a kind of threat space that is new and unwelcome. We continue our conversation with these election administration officials in 4 closely contested states from Atlanta. The threats to you, Madam Secretary, do they come from within the state or out of the state?
All over.
All over. So both?
Yeah, all over. And yeah, to a certain extent, I imagine even international. But it's always, and I always try to remind myself that the threats are directed at me as a person. They're really directed at our democracy, and they're really directed at trying to intimidate not just me and election officials, but voters from believing in our elections and from standing up to protect them. And so our actions, I think, can reflect what we hope all American citizens' actions should be, which is to stand defiantly in the face of those threats and keep marching forward anyway, emboldened to protect our elections and that very basis of our democracy.
Bill, I saw you nodding. You have experience with this as well.
Yeah, I do.
How are you holding up, and how are your people doing?
We're doing well. No, I appreciate it. This has unfortunately become a way of life for us in Maricopa County and a lot of other places around the country. But we're going to have the workers that we need for this election. And actually, we're grateful to our partners in that, who are the Republican and Democratic parties, who help us to recruit these folks. But we do understand that there are threats out there, and we've invested as a board in metal detectors, in fencing, in cameras. I wish we didn't have to do this, but we do. And in fact, we're very grateful to the Department of Justice, who, working with them, they have actually prosecuted more folks for threatening Arizona election officials than any other state in the union.
And how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I mean, I've talked about some of the challenges that I've had that are much like those of others. And, you know, I've gone and gotten the support that I need, and I'm feeling great. I'm grateful to the support we've gotten from around the country, and the whole team feels that way in Maricopa. So we're ready to do this.
Gabe, how are things in Georgia? Do you have enough people? How do they feel?
We feel confident in the poll workers. In fact, a lot of it's built on defiance of this. And there's still caution. I mean, we've also done a lot of training with bringing elections officials together with local law enforcement. We've got a tool we used in 2022, we're using again in 2024, the texting tool for every poll manager that will notify the state elections office, the county elections office, and the local sheriff's office if there's an issue. And using a text tool lets us know what it is. Is it somebody yelling at people in the parking lot, or is it somebody with a gun? So we've done a lot of that. We've done a lot of tabletops with the FBI and CISA, which I always screw up when I try to say what the actual acronym means, but it's about cybersecurity. And we're focused on security, we're focused on safety, we're focused on ease of use for voters. We're going to have a good voting experience in Georgia. I feel very confident of that. We have never really had a lot of the poll worker issues in terms of the numbers that other states have had, because our people said, this is what we do. We're going to help our neighbors vote.
I'm going to ask all the same questions. Seth, I want to start with you. If you could, with a magic wand, dispel one piece of election-related disinformation, what would that be?
That there are magical ballot drops in the middle of the night, that we stop counting ballots and then all of a sudden we look for what the results are and then try to manipulate those results by injecting ballots into them. Our election workers are working around the clock to count hundreds of thousands of ballots, and that takes a lot of time. And if people come in and they serve as poll watchers or canvass observers, they can really see what the process is and get a better understanding of how those results get released. And it's really important that they can then communicate to the general public about these processes. So dispelling that myth would be really helpful, because that window of time from when the polls close until the networks are able to call the race is really where that window of misinformation can spread. And by shrinking that window and explaining what is happening during that time period, hopefully we can improve the entire post-election period.
Madam Secretary, magic wand, one bit of disinformation you can dispel, what would it be?
Well, in Michigan, we count every valid vote and only valid votes. And so we'd want to dispel the myth that any votes we count are invalid. There's no evidence of that. There's only evidence, despite or that's been reinforced by hundreds of audits and other types of investigations, that we count every valid vote and only valid votes in our state.
Bill?
For me, it would be the conspiracy theory that our tabulation machines are connected to the internet. They're not. And people are not hacking into our tabulation machines and changing the results. And so as a result, we've taken hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people through our tabulation center in Maricopa County and pointed out to them, it's visible, this is not connected to the internet in any way.
Gabe?
Every valid vote is counted and no invalid votes are counted. Your vote is going to count. Vote any way you choose, absentee, early, election day. Your vote is going to count. And one of the biggest things I think is a problem on my side of the aisle as a Republican is a lot of people are focused on election integrity. We're going to have poll watchers, we're going to have poll workers, some of this stuff. If they want to win elections, go knock on a door, go persuade somebody. Talking about the 2020 election over and over again drives away those voters you need for your values to win on election day. I mean, it's like whack-a-mole. No matter what we do in every one of our states, we think we dispel something, it comes up on Twitter 48 hours later. People still think there was a water main break at State Farm Arena that stopped counting, and then we got secret boxes of ballots out. We've explained this over and over again, and people don't want to believe it. So magic wand is obviously magic wand. It's not a real thing. We just have to get through this election one more time and prove once again that we have the safest, most secure elections in the world in the United States of America.
I want to ask you all about something I've heard in my travels this year. Voters say to me, I'm afraid that all these illegals are going to vote. Bill?
This is another one of those conspiracy theories that's out there. In Arizona, in particular, to vote in our state and local elections, you have to provide identification proving that you're a citizen. This is a boogeyman. It's not happening. If it's happening, it's very, very small numbers. But in Arizona, and I know across the country, this is not something that people should be concerned about.
Madam Secretary?
You know, I understand the fear, but it's an unfounded fear. There's no evidence, widespread evidence, of anyone other than eligible citizens voting in our elections. In Michigan and in, I believe, many other states, there is verification methods in place to ensure, even when someone is registering, that their registration is validated through documents that show they're citizens. In Michigan, when you're registered to vote at our offices, when you get your license or your ID, you have to show documentation to get your ID, and that documentation reveals your citizenship, whether it's your Social Security card, which affirms citizenship, or it's a green card, which doesn't, and that ensures that we are only registering U.S. citizens to vote in our elections. And then on top of that, we have many layers of checks and balances and reaffirmations of someone's citizenship before they get a ballot and before that ballot is counted. So I'm confident that the lack of evidence of anyone other than citizens voting in our elections speaks for itself. But I understand that we've heard this misinformation, this fear-based deception for a long time now, and I understand those concerns, but there's no evidence to back them up.
Gabe?
Well, in Georgia, we're a real ID state, similar to Michigan, where we tie our Department of Driver Services to your voter registration, same address. And everybody knows what a pain in the rear it is now to get a real ID. You got to have a passport or a birth certificate that your parents had 20 years earlier. So it is very difficult. But it's not a hurdle anymore because everybody has to do it to get their license. And even if you file on paper, you have to put your driver's license number down so we can confirm those things. And if we don't confirm it, we have this special bucket over here called MIDR, or citizenship pending. So it's not happening. The reality of some of this is there are certain jurisdictions in America that let non-citizens who are legally here vote. And there is there's a policy argument about it. Let's have a policy argument.
I mean,
That's
local
fine.
elections.
Local elections. And that could be problematic. That's a policy argument. But are there thousands of illegals, millions of them coming over, who are going to somehow be able to register to vote and somehow vote and risk their opportunity to ever be a citizen and commit a felony for it? That seems pretty slim to me.
Seth?
Yeah, there's no evidence that illegal aliens are registering and voting in our elections. And this is something that Secretary Schmidt and I worked on as far back as 2017. And we saw that while there were some non-citizens registered at that time, it was because they were presented that option at the DMV, and we put a stop to it. So it's been a long time that this type of accusation has been out there, and we're just not seeing it in any real numbers.
Segment 3 of the Takeout coming your way. We'll be right back.
They just need to tell us what the rules are, and we're going to comply with them. For better or worse, we've followed the law throughout.
Welcome back to the Takeout. You know this show is devoted to a lengthier conversation than you're going to find in most places about complex issues that might be coming at you, and we're going to address several of them in this segment. One, are non-citizens, undocumented immigrants, likely to participate, meaning vote, in this upcoming presidential election? What is the disinformation space that election administration officials are dealing with? And what is the value proposition about accuracy and speed when reporting and verifying and then eventually certifying election results? All that coming up in our conversation with 4 top election administration officials from 4 closely contested states. So I'll throw this out to anyone who can take this on. Former President Trump has told the House Republicans to shut the government down if they don't pass this federal piece of legislation to prevent illegals from participating in federal elections. I'm listening to the 4 of you, and it sounds like it's not a problem.
Well, there is one particular part, and I think the National Voter Registration Act absolutely has to be amended and changed because it's antiquated. And one of the things on there doesn't officially let us ask the question when you're registering from the federal side. So there is a minor thing that could be exploited, but in all of our states, we have our own state laws that get in the way of that.
That are safeguards.
They're safeguards, yeah. Safeguards and guardrails. That's what we all focus on all the time to make sure we have an efficient election system. But I would love to have some of these things. And I think there's 90% agreement. Only American citizens should be voting. Let's just pass it and move on.
Madam Secretary, any
Yeah,
thoughts?
it's a redundant piece of legislation that's meant to really just keep us talking about this issue and create fear among citizens that their votes are going to be outweighed by votes of people who are not eligible to participate in our elections. So our job is now, what this creates is a scenario where we have to push back on the misinformation and clarify the truth, and we'll continue to do that. But that said, I wish our lawmakers would talk to us more about what they want and what we need in our elections, because I think election policy is best when it's data-driven and informed by election professionals, not politicians. So what you see here really is the political misuse of an effort to change or create a redundant election policy to create a sort of air of suspicion around our elections. And I think that's how we have to see all of these pieces as opposed to a sincere and genuine effort to improve the integrity of our elections.
Bill, it's a big issue in Arizona.
In the end, we don't set the rules for the elections at Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. They're set by the state legislature, they're set by Congress. They just need to tell us what the rules are, and we're going to comply with them. For better or worse, we've followed the law throughout, to our political peril for some of us. But that's our job. We have to make sure every eligible vote is counted, whatever the law is at that time.
And this is not a problem in Maricopa County now.
It's not a problem. We've made that clear. And in fact, we have strong protections in place, just like we do in other states around the country. We need to be focused on other issues. Like Gabe said, as a Republican, I would argue Republicans ought to be talking about those values that we all share, focusing on that going into the election.
Seth touched on this, so I want to ask the 3 of you about it. He said, in the time it takes for counting, whatever that is, hours, a day, or 2 days, is a kind of place in which either misinformation can run rampant or people can get anxious and possibly violent. Are you nervous about that in-between time, Madam Secretary?
It was my biggest concern in 2020, that window between when the polls close and the unofficial results are made clear. How can we assure the public that what's actually happening is the valid counting of every vote in a secure and efficient way? And so that's on us. That's our job to make sure during that period we are transparent, we are welcoming people into the process so they can see everything we're doing, to ensure the accuracy of those unofficial totals once they're announced, and to give people updates throughout the period so that we can hopefully quell the anxiety that I think even just, everyone might feel watching the results. And everyone knows that this election is going to decide the future of our country, and people are anxious, we understand, to know who won, and especially in states like ours. And so we recognize that anxiety, and we're going to do everything we can to get those results as soon as possible. But those results need to be securely counted in an efficient way, and that's what we'll be trying to assure the public of in that time period.
Gabe?
In Georgia, we've put pre-processing into the law for our small amount of absentee ballots we're going to have. We have a new law that says the early vote totals have to be put into our election night reporting system by 8 p.m. on Election Day. So we'll have the majority of our votes will be out there by 8 p.m. So we've taken steps to logistically make sure those things happen. And in 2020, we didn't really think about that too much. And had always been sort of a way that counties had done things before. Like, we do the absentee ballots last all at one time. We're like, every 15 minutes you're going to upload something. You better stay on it. So we've tried to work with the counties on that. And it's unfortunate, and people said, Georgia took so long, Michigan took so long.
We took 24 hours.
Okay, you took 24 hours. Arizona took so long. But I mean, the reality was we were done before like Florida and New York and California because they were blowouts, And that's the reality of a close election. If you want to make it right, you've got to make sure you get everything in there, do your reconciliations, but we've now put systems into place to make sure we do it properly and get it out there as fast as we possibly can.
Bill?
So I'll take accuracy over speed every day. Now we are, as Gabe has referenced, things are different in Arizona. We're the only Western state here, and in the West we have a lot of vote by mail. And in particular, we're anticipating up to 500,000 mail-in ballots being dropped off on Election Day in Maricopa County. That's allowed under the law, so we're operating within that context. Over the past few decades, it takes about 10 to 13 days to complete the count in Arizona. So this is nothing new. We're used to this. Most people who've been paying attention are used to this. But we've got new people who are engaged. And so just like the Secretary was saying, we have swung the doors open in Maricopa County. During that period, we did 16 press conferences in 2022, keeping people updated, helping them understand what the process is as it goes along. But again, accuracy over speed every time.
I want to ask you about something else I hear people talk about that they're afraid of. I'll start with you, Seth. They're afraid that they'll see something on social media about some violence at a precinct or some suggestion that a precinct has been closed. And they don't know whether it's true or not, and they don't know how to react to that, either violence or some other thing telling them that voting has been stopped or halted or gummed up, and they don't know what to do or how to react. Do you worry about that kind of thing happening on Election Day if there's going to be more in-person voting?
So we have contingency plans in place to communicate directly with voters if something like that were to occur. We do a lot of preparation. We did it before 2020. We're doing it now. To work with law enforcement and our partners in city government and at the state and federal level. And then we also try and direct voters to official sources of information. So making sure that they're going to a .gov website or to our official social media accounts. And we try and make that clear so they know exactly where to get accurate information from.
Do you feel like you're ramping that up more than ever?
We've been preparing for it for 4 years now. I mean, we experienced 2020. It was different than any election I'd ever managed before, and this will be my 4th presidential election that we've managed. But with that experience, we've taken what we learned, and we're continuing to iterate and improve our communication and our operations.
Madam Secretary.
Yeah, I think we are similarly very committed to making sure that everyone feels safe on Election Day, and that we have partners with law enforcement to ensure that if there is an issue, we can rapidly respond. We're particularly concerned about the potential use of artificial intelligence to mislead people into thinking there's something happening at a polling place to try to deter them from showing up. And it's one of the reasons why we are similarly creating trusted voices throughout the state, places where people can go, faith leaders, for example, who will be out in abundance on Election Day to try to push back misinformation or respond to things online. And we're also working with federal law enforcement to ensure that we're monitoring all the chatter so that if we see anything bubbling up falsely, we can respond to it. We'll also have a field team from my office in place all across the state so that if there is anything like a flood or a real challenge in a physical polling location, we can respond to get the truthful word out and provide an opportunity for people to course correct. But the bottom line in Michigan is because you can vote from home, because you can vote early, we're also encouraging people to take advantage of those options so that can minimize the pressures on Election Day that could erupt from either a real or perceived or imagined incident at a polling place.
The voices of Jocelyn Benson of Michigan, Bill Gates of Arizona, Seth Bluestein of Pennsylvania, and Gabriel Sterling of Georgia, election administration officials all talking about this upcoming big election.
We want everybody's vote to count, and we don't want there to be ticky-tacky things to disenfranchise voters.
Welcome back to the Takeout. There has been a surge of newly registered voters this summer. We asked these election administration officials, does that tax the system in any particular way? And are there any generalized concerns that they have about post-election certification of the results at the county level? That conversation coming your way. Have you noticed anything interesting in terms of newly registered voters in the last couple of weeks or couple of months?
Yeah, ever since the Democratic Party switched out who their nominee was going to be, we've seen a big uptick in interest in the election. So we've seen a lot more registration in Philadelphia, a lot more people applying for mail ballots. So that energy is definitely on the upswing.
Gabe?
Well, it's hard to register in Georgia only because everybody's already registered. Because of our automatic voter registration in 2020, we were at 98%. If you were eligible, you were registered. So we've seen an uptick overall, but we're talking in the thousands. But it really was since the Democrats switched out their candidate, which wasn't unexpected. So it has added some new voters, and the excitement level is there. But the excitement level on the other side is going to be a hard-fought battle in all these states.
Madam Secretary?
So just to clarify, the president said he's not running again, and then his vice president stepped up to accept the nomination. There was, anyway, the characterization of that for both, anyway. All right, so I mean, we have automatic voter registration in our state, and what also was launched this summer was pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. So we actually have seen an uptick in young people registering to vote in our state, which is a really encouraging thing, and is a result of a lot of the roundtables and other types of outreach we're doing and other organizations are doing. In addition to that, with automatic voter registration, we have, like Georgia, a situation where most people are registered. We still see many people who are registered not participating or voting, and that's what we're really focusing on as well. So the real question will be, does this increase in voter registration translate into more people, particularly from underrepresented communities, participating in this election? And that remains to be seen, but we'll certainly know that in the months ahead.
Bill?
We've seen an uptick in interest as well. Again, not only the presidential race, but we have a lot of hot button issues that are going to be on the ballot. And if you're not registered yet in Arizona, it's not too late. You have until October 7th.
You know, we call these states battleground states. Maybe a better way to think about them is closely contested. And their election administration has been under scrutiny for a long time. They think they're up and ready. But we asked Gabriel Sterling if he has any concerns about places that are not closely contested, and are they ready for any pressure points or scrutiny or things going off the rails?
It's a really deep blue state. And essentially, you look in every state in the United States, there's a blue city with a red state around it, essentially. And the counties that are deeply red in a very blue state, if their laws aren't clear, they could stop certification and have to go to the courts, and they're not prepared for it because they weren't thinking about it. That's the kind of thing that worries me somewhat, because it does two things. It stops those electoral votes coming forward, but it can stop that congressional delegation from being seated at the same time. So I've been talking about this. We want everybody's vote to count, and we don't want there to be ticky-tacky things to disenfranchise voters. At the same time, you don't want to leave a wide truck-level opening in states so you're not thinking about where the threats might be, as opposed to all of us have thought through every scenario you can possibly imagine. Well, at this point, I'm never going to say every scenario because there's always something new. But there's a lot of these states that haven't had to think about the stress test they may face, and that's what worries me.
Does that worry anyone else?
I similarly share a concern that the experience, it's reflected in the fact that the experience that battleground states have had, and that all of us as election officials in those states have had over the last 4 years, is different than those who are running elections in other states, but it's not completely different. We have all had the spotlight on us to a greater extent than I think many who entered into these positions anticipated. So there are, I think, a number of ways in which all of us are working, even if the spotlight's not on our state, to be ready for this moment. But certainly there are a number of, thousands of jurisdictions all across the country, any of which can be vulnerable in a moment like this. And so I do think we have to be mindful of the fact that the preparations we're doing in battleground states do similarly need to be happening in every state in this country to ensure that, whether it's in a congressional district or in another race, that any attempt to delegitimize democracy anywhere in our country is stymied by the leadership of election officials in that area.
Gabe, you gained national, some might say international attention in 2020, talking about certain rhetoric around the election and the threat it could create or increase for violence. Anything you want to say about that now?
I think that threat remains viable, if for no other reason than you create an environment that people feel like they have no choice, especially people who are mentally unstable to begin with. It gives them a rational excuse in their mind, or for people who are somewhat rational, who may accept that only violence will get to get to the point of my values being protected because the system is no longer working. And we have ballots so we can avoid bullets. So anybody undermining these systems, winning or actually just losing, I guess, for 200 years, the loser accepting the outcome and coming back to fight again in 2 to 4 years was the way the system works, and we all accepted it. We have to get back to that being the normal way of dealing with elections.
Any thoughts on that, Seth?
That's why it's so important that elections officials from all over the country are talking to each other and learning best practices, because something that happens in a deep red county or deep blue county in a state that's not a swing state can still have an impact on everyone. I know after 2020, there were lots of accusations about things that happened in Philadelphia that didn't even take place in Philadelphia. They're showing video of a different jurisdiction and claiming it's Philadelphia. So working together as a group, as a whole field where we're all trained as elections officials and we care deeply about doing our job well and not just focusing on the swing states but all over is really important.
Madam Secretary.
Yeah, we're all facing what is in many ways a coordinated effort to delegitimize democracy, to attack our own integrity and the integrity of our systems, to cast aspersions and doubt about the validity of our election procedures. So to the extent that we're facing a coordinated effort to do all those things, our coordinated response is important. And I think that's why you'll see us working together more and in lockstep across party lines than we did in 2020, and that's a great thing. The other thing I'll add is I started my career investigating extremist leaders and organizations and the way in which their rhetoric causes their followers to commit violent acts. There's a direct line between that violent rhetoric from leaders or threats into actual actions taken by followers to make those threats real. And so that's still real. I know Gabe spoke out about it in 2020. We're all very grateful for it. But as he emphasized, we've now endured 4 years of that same rhetoric. And that's why I think all of us do feel a little bit of a heightened state of anxiety going into this cycle, that it's even more possible than it was in those darkest days of 2020, that we could see that rhetoric transform into violent acts in the weeks ahead, and we all have to brace ourselves for that.
Bill?
I'm proud of the 3 people I'm sitting with here. They have all spoken out against threats to elections officials. But I continue to be disappointed by many people in the Republican Party, elected officials, who continue to be silent in the face of these threats. But it's not too late. We cannot normalize threats of violence against anyone, but particularly those people who are literally running our democracy.
Thank you all very much. It's a very big election. We all know that. I hope you feel better now, or at least feel more informed about the way in closely contested states it's going to be handled. We'll see you next week.